Well, good afternoon. Today we're in Psalm 120, and I entitled this chapter about the danger and the consequence of false accusations. That is, people who lie about you and they slander you. And so let's take a look at that for a moment today, because over in James chapter 1, it talks about over there that pure religion and undefiled before the fatherless is to visit the widows in their affliction, and of course that is to help them when they're in some deep trouble. But what he slips in there that few people give attention to is, if a man does not bridle his tongue, that is, control his tongue, even though he supposes himself to be religious, he said that his religion is in vain. So that verse ought to slow us down right to begin with. So in Psalm 120, let's take a look at this for just a moment today. For he says, in my distress, and of course we learn in verse 2 where the distress was coming from false accusation and lying tongues. People were saying bad things about him. They were lying about him. And I think sometimes we ought to give some thought to about how evil it is to slander people and to ruin their reputation. If we would think for a moment about how terrible it is to do that, and if you've ever experienced somebody lying about you or making false accusations against you, you just know how terrible it is. So the psalmist speaks about his distress. I mean, think about this for just a moment. Back in the day when I was growing up, if you got yourself in a Friday night fight rather, and got the tar beaten out of you, at least it was over. But I'll tell you one thing, this business about ruining people's reputation isn't over in a 30-minute Friday night fight. It goes on and it haunts people. I just want you to see how evil and terrible it is to do that kind of stuff. Now look here. I cried unto the Lord, and he heard me, and he asked the Lord to deliver his soul, that is his life. And by the way, that word deliver there in Psalm 120 means to rescue. It's a strong word, almost as snatching something out of the mouth of a lion. So there's great distress here, and he's asking the Lord to deliver him from these lying folks, these lying lips, and from a deceitful tongue. You see, that's why I'm saying they're saying things that just were not true. Now, what shall I give unto him? And I'll tell you what, that's a little misleading here in this particular verse, because what he's really asking is, and he's really, let's slow down a moment, because he's really addressing his enemies, and he's saying to them, what do you think the Lord is going to do to you? Now that's something important to think about, isn't it? Here's what he says, or what shall be done to thee, thou false tongue? Verse number 4, here's what's going to happen. Here's the consequences. And here's what he says, sharp arrows of the mighty, that is of God. God, he's just using some terminology that they would be familiar with. I mean, when the enemy would shoot those arrows at you, you're in some real deep trouble. And that's what he says, with coals of juniper, King James, that referred to what they called back then a broom tree. And out there in the desert, think about when you put that thing on fire, it just consumed it totally. And so what he's saying to these people that are doing that, God's going to deal with you, and he's going to deal with you very harshly. In verse number 5, woe unto me. Now, here's what he's saying in verse number 5, and sojourning in these different places, that he's in a place that's far from God. He's in a place that's inhabited by pagan people, ungodly people, and God God has not delivered him yet, and he's just thinking about how hard it is to live around these kind of folks, evil association, and he's hoping that God gets him out of there. But while he's there, trouble's stirring. Then in verse number 5, my soul, again, my life longs to dwell with him that hateth peace. Look at this. Let me read verse 7 too, and you'll get the gist of what he's saying here. I am for peace. I want peace. I don't want trouble. I didn't like this stuff. I didn't want this stuff. I didn't want this battle. But every time I spoke, verse number 7, they are of war. In other words, every time I spoke against certain things, I'm met with hostility from these folks. And that's why he said back in verse 6, how long do I got to live with these people? God, get me out of it. That's an interesting chapter, isn't it, about false accusation and slander. And again, just let me say this. That's a horrible thing to slander. And by the way, you get the word devil out of that. And you just got to think sometimes about when you're slandering and running folks down and saying terrible things about people. You're doing the devil's work, and that's not the work of the Lord. And if you're given to that stuff where you get around folks like that, you just stay away from them and don't get caught up with that kind of business. And that's why it's a bunch of business of distress, and it causes a lot of distress and harmful distress about people. Let's be careful about our words. Those are some thoughts for today, and we'll be in Psalm 121 tomorrow. See you then.